We're back. So today we're going to be talking about international relations and geography. So nations interact as communities and individuals do, and many ways to define nations, like ideology, among location. One way is also among levels of economic development. Example, may have heard the term Third World before. Comes from a definition of nations according to development dating to the Cold War. First World generally considered the U.S., Canada, and Western Europe. These are advanced nations with high standards of living and high levels of technology. Very well developed, very advanced infrastructure systems. Second World generally was Russia and Eastern Europe. Again, they weren't considered to be very advanced in terms of human rights. Some sophisticated levels of technology and infrastructure, but very low standard of living. Most of Eastern Europe has been catching up to Europe since the end of the Cold War, but standard of living are generally lower and still very, very low in Russia. So outside of a handful of millionaires and billionaires, most Russians are actually pretty poor. And the Third World, that includes basically undeveloped nations or underdeveloped. Sometimes they're called today they're sometimes called emerging nations. These are nations that have very low levels of infrastructure, particularly outside the larger cities. Very low standards of living, high levels of poverty. Technological availability is limited. This includes a lot of Latin America and Africa, many portions of Southern Asia. But because of the emergence of nations such as China and India is a technological and economic giants, that's kind of skewed this example of what the Third World is. First World, in the United States, we sometimes have the expression first world problems, like your internet isn't working right, or you're having problems with a glitch opening an app on your cell phone, like say your latest iPhone. Call those first world problems. That is, just they're not problems; they're just simply inconveniences. Because here in the United States, we've got food on the table. We've got a roof over our heads, got clean water, we're a nation at peace, and our biggest concern is, can we download the latest YouTube video or the latest app? So compared to the millions of people starving around the world, millions of people living without clean water or without infrastructure, it's kind of not much of a problem compared to people in those parts of the world. And so the problems of the emerging world, or the Third World, are often very intense. Many are seeing progress impeded by continuing civil wars, ethnic strife. For example, take Rwanda, Burundi, and Africa. Two nations were decimated by intense ethnic hatred between the Hutus and the Tutsis in 1994 that left 1 million people dead in the course of a summer. Issues of corruption. the most corrupt nations in the world generally are these emerging nations. And basically because economic pressures are much higher. Intense poverty. And plus, lack of infrastructure means it's difficult to have a system in place that maintains checks and balances, that's able to protect the people against the ravages of corruption. Like, say, in Brazil, for example, millions of people survive on just $1 a day. In fact, um, about a third of the world survives on $2 a day or less. HIV and AIDS continue to infect millions and devastate southern Africa. Polio has been eradicated in most of the world except for just a couple of countries, most notably Pakistan and Afghanistan, two nations with very poor health care infrastructure. But a number of different concepts are at work when describing the relationships of various nations with each other, particularly between the developed world and the developing world. I'll give you a rundown of some of these ideas here. We got in colonialism. Colonialism is the direct control of an area of land and resources for the aggrandizement of a particular nation, sometimes for settlement of an unsettled land. Direct control of a nation, an area by another nation. Um, this example of Britain, Spain, and France colonizing the Americas in the 1600s and 1700s, and Africa in the 1800s. There's the Cayman for the resources. Spain going into Latin America for gold and silver and other available resources. Britain coming to the Atlantic coast for farmland. Trade in France establishing a trade empire in the interior of North America. But understand the purpose of colonialism is one thing: make money. It's always about the cash. That's why these nations put so much into defending these different areas, because it's all about making money for the mother country. Now, the concept of neocolonialism. It's indirecting control of a nation through economic means rather than political or military means. And so you don't have the government in place, may not even have the troops in place, but you still have control of it. And it's still economics, still all that money. So today, nations of the world, they don't conquer with armies, they conquer with dollars. The United States has a extensive influence around the world because of our cultural impact. You may see demonstrations denouncing America in different parts of the world, but what are they doing? They're wearing Coca-Cola T-shirts or something like that, or T-shirts with the American iconic cartoon characters. Um, Larger nations, especially larger economic powers like Europe and the United States, may have a lot of influence in the area because of our economic strength, the amount of money we have invested in a particular country. We can sway a country on legislation one way or another. We can sway public opinion one way or another because of our cultural influences or economic influences. been some concern about China as a neo-colonial influence because while China doesn't have a lot of troops outside of China, but they have a lot of influence in a lot of developing nations in Africa. They've been loaning a bunch of money to African nations to try to help them develop infrastructure, but this is money these nations can't pay back, and China's trying to exert economic influence on them based on the debts they have and their trade relationship with China. This is all slightly different from the idea of imperialism. Imperialism is the policy of aggressively dominating a country for its resources. The colonial empires of Europe largely followed this example until their collapse in the 20th century. All these different nations became independent. That is, imperialism is a tool for promoting colonialism. Another country for its resources. For example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that was an example of imperialism. Russia wanted to expand its territory and influence by force in order to dominate its resources. But take neighboring Belarus. Russia hadn't have to invade them to gain control of the resources. It's a neo-colonial example. Russia indirectly dominates Belarus. Essentially, Moscow tells Minsk what they want, what kind of policies they want, and Belarus jumps and does whatever they want. Neo-colonialism. Because they couldn't do the same with Ukraine, that's why they invaded in 2022. Got the idea of nationalism. This is the belief in a community beyond the locality joined by a common language, culture, history, and religion. Common language, culture, ethnicity, language, religion, and or history. Because you're joined together because you have something in common, something beyond just common government. This idea really started coming to the forefront during the French Revolution. The idea that the French nation was a nation not because they're ruled by the Bourbon monarchs, but because they were because of their common history as Frenchmen, their common custom, religion, language, and so forth. But the problem with nationalism, though, is it sometimes goes beyond just that sense of community. It becomes a problem when it becomes an excuse to dominate another group. That is the idea that you're better than another group, or that this group, because it's better than someone else, deserves to dominate and control this other group. Nationalism sometimes is used to expand a nation at the expense of another. This is the driving force behind many independence, but it's also the driving force behind many independence movements in the Third World. Yugoslavia, for example. When the Cold War ended, Yugoslavia broke up into different ethnic states. Ethnic states, these independents were driven by ideas of nationalism. That is, they should be able to control, they had a common interest, common community, and they should be able to control their own fate. But this independence was fought against by Serbian nationalism. A lot of Serb nationalists thought they were better than everyone else and should control that area, control the Croats and the Bosnians, and so they fought a series of wars against them for that purpose. Now, dozens of nations are at war now, either with external enemies or civil conflicts that are tearing nations apart from within. Example of this be the Russia-Ukraine war. For 2 years now, Ukraine's been fighting to maintain its independence after Russia invaded it. Lebanon and Syria. After Lebanon's civil war from 1975 to 1988 crippled it, Syria moved in to dominate the country politically and militarily by 1991. North Korea and South Korea. In 1950, communist North Korea invaded the South, with the invasion repelled only by a United Nations force. It left 2 million Koreans dead and 33,000 Americans dead by 1953. No peace treaty was ever formalized between North and South Korea, leaving the two nations technically at war. Although there have been some brief little skirmishes, there's never been any kind of anything to really anything to threaten the peace on any large scale. North Korea announced that it had nuclear weapons capable of hitting the Pacific coast of the U.S., Russia, South Korea, and Japan, which complicated matters significantly, but North Korea's problem is that it's ruled by the most extreme totalitarian system, and it has basically left their people starving in deep poverty. North Korea is basically using all their resources to build up on high-tech nuclear systems and missile systems while their people have nothing. And while North Korea periodically launch missiles to show that they have these missiles, try to get people's attention, it's basically a little more than a nuisance. Even in South Korea, where they've been on the front lines with against North Korea for decades, they really just don't take North Korea very seriously anymore. Or Indonesia and East Timor. East Timor was granted independence in 1975, but it was soon invaded and absorbed into Indonesia. Years of riots and civil war erupted in East Timor receiving independence in 2002. Sudan is an example of a nation torn apart by civil war. Different factions fighting for control of the country. End up in South Sudan gaining independence early in the century. But still, areas like Darfur in the west are still fighting against the main government, Khartoum. Yemen is at the middle of a civil war. You have several factions fighting for control, most notably the Houthis, which have gained control of western Yemen. And they've been trying to enlarge the war by disrupting sea traffic in the Red Sea for some time now. Another example would be Syria. Even though the government in Damascus still has a lot of influence in Lebanon, it's lost influence across a lot of the country. They've been fighting these different factions for control of the country for years now. India and Pakistan. After independence in 1947, the two nations have fought 3 wars over the Muslim-majority province of Kashmir. It's in northwestern India. Currently, the province is divided into zones of control by India, Pakistan, and China. Skirmishes continue between India and Pakistan, now nuclear powers. In 2002, they very nearly went to war with each other. And the situation in Israel. The creation of the Jewish state of Israel in 1947 enraged Arabs across the Middle East, sparking four major wars between Israel and most of its neighbors. It's included the War of Independence in 1948, the 1956 Suez Canal Crisis, the 1967 Six-Day War, and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. But these wars left Israel in control of what was supposed to become Palestine, left embittered Arab and Palestinian populations in their wake. The situation still continues today. Last October, Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip, an area basically it's a little bit bigger than the size of Little Rock, but a population of about 2 million, they launched a terrorist attack across southern Israel, which left over 1,000 people dead, and Israel responded with extreme force, basically moving into level Gaza and wipe out Hamas. It's still going on today. Now, issues of free trade and reduced tariffs proliferated in the 1990s on into the early 21st century. Businessmen anxiously looked to higher profits from increased trade, while others worried about potential social repercussions. And all these agreements have met with some intense criticism and protest. For example, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is in 1994. Took down all trade barriers between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico in 1993. Now, again, these are examples of extra-national associations, of international associations and agreements. U.S., Canada, and Mexico maintain their own governments and they're completely independent of one another. But they do have a lot of shared interests because of this free trade zone they created. 2005, this was expanded into CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Association, with the U.S., Canada, Mexico, most nations of Central America, and the Dominican Republic. The Free Trade Association of the Americas was proposed in 1994 with the 34 democracies of the Western Hemisphere attempting to create a giant free trade zone, but it's kind of stalled out. The General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. It's an international trade agreement. Treaties began in 1948. Now includes 110 countries. Most countries on Earth. The World Trade Organization was created in 1995. Again, to try to administer these trade agreements, because there are a lot of technical issues involved with trade, especially if you got tariffs or anything else like that, concerns over health and safety inspections and so forth. Another one is OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's founded in 1960. It comprises 11 of the major oil exporting nations, often described as developing nations. These nations include Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia. And they later included Libya, Qatar, Indonesia, the United Arab Emirates, Gabon, Algeria, Ecuador, and Nigeria. And what they do is they get together and they decide quotas on oil production and oil prices. And of course, the United Nations. They have a very simple website, UN.org. Tells you all about them. Founded in 1945. just as World War II was ending, founded by 51 nations to promote world peace and human rights. With the addition of Switzerland and East Timor in 2002, membership now stands at 191. This includes recognized nation states as well as areas of granted what they call observer status. Its main headquarters is in New York City, but also has offices in Vienna and Geneva, in addition to its missions around the world. Now, one thing about the United Nations is they have a whole bunch of programs beyond just simply nations gathering together and discussing common problems. You've got the UNHCR, the UN High Commission on Refugees. This aids millions of people in dozens of countries. Essentially making sure that even though they may have been driven from their nations by a civil war or by a natural disaster, their job is to make sure that these refugees have some safe housing, even maybe in a simple tent city, but also food, water, and medical care. Basically saving the lives of millions of people and helping keep these situations from destabilizing even further by this mass movement of humanity. UNICEF, which is very famous, the United Nations Children's Education Fund. Basically helping people set up schools around the world, also vaccination programs, HIV and AIDS programs, the UN AIDS program. UNDP, which is the United Nations Development Program, helping nations, developing nations develop infrastructure such as hospitals and schools and so forth. WFP, the United Nations World Food Program. They help feed millions of people around the world. So they do quite a bit to try to help promote human rights and just the survival of people around the world. Like I said, the United Nations has over a dozen peacekeeping missions around the world, including Cyprus and across Africa and South America. We're doing quite a bit. The thing about the United Nations is these peacekeeping programs only exist where they're authorized by the United Nations General Assembly. It is all the nations together deciding should a peacekeeping mission be sent in this particular area or not. So that's just one. Another big association would be the European Union. European Union comprises about more than 30 nations across Europe. They're united into a common market that is no trade, essentially no tariffs, free passage of goods across national borders, a common currency, the euro. Essentially, while these nations are all independent, it's essentially uniting them all economically, just one big market zone. And it's rapidly becoming one of the largest economic forces in the world. All these nations working together. And of course, there's NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded in 1949, now comprises 32 nations. Finland and Sweden, which have been neutral for years, they have since joined NATO after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Actually, and it's defensive nations in the North Atlantic: Canada, the United States, Great Britain, Scandinavian countries, Germany, the former Eastern Bloc, Poland, Hungary, Austria, Czechia, and Slovakia, France, Spain, all part of a defensive alliance, all designed to promote democracy and stability and defend each other. Like I said, it's been a very long-lasting, very stable alliance. But only once has the Self-Defense Pact been initiated, what we call Article 5 under the NATO Treaty. That was when the United States was subjected to the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. But after the collapse of communism, there's been some question about what direction should NATO take. And for right now, the war in Ukraine has got NATO's attention, with NATO nations working to provide aid for Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Yeah, these are just a few examples. There are dozens of different international organizations all over the world, big and small, and for all sorts of different purposes. But overall, the general trend towards the world last since the 20th century has been towards independence of different states, but also cooperation among these existing independent states, and particularly the promotion of human rights around the world. Let's go ahead and leave it at that for right now, and we'll see you all next time.